Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. Today's guest is British author Christian Wolmar, who has written almost 20 books about transportation, railways, and today we're specifically going to discuss the world's longest railway and his book called To the Edge of the World, the story of the Trans-Siberian Express, the world's greatest railroad. Welcome to the show, Christian.
Thank you. Well, welcome to you.
Now let's begin discussing the Trans-Siberian Railroad. What made you interested in transportation and railways in the beginning?
Well, I'd written a few books about transport already. I wrote a book on the London Underground. I wrote a book on Britain's railways and the impact of the world on the world of railways generally, and one on war and railways, which is a whole subject of itself, which came up quite a lot in this history, in fact. And so it was tempting to look at what is undoubtedly one of the greatest engineering achievements ever. And as I'm half Russian, my father was called Boris, and actually fought in the First World War for the Russians, and briefly comes into the story, actually. I thought, let's look at this railway. And what actually really intrigued me is that the Russians are often looked down upon. In fact, we look down upon them now as, a strange, sometimes rogue country that's never had a proper democracy, that, might be the biggest country in terms of area in the world, but has kind of underachieved. And we fail to recognize the fantastic achievements of the Russians. Not only, of course, in engineering and building this railway, but in arts, in literature, in culture, architecture.
Everything.
You only have to go to St. Petersburg to see some of the best townscapes ever. So this was partly the aim of kind of reclaiming a bit of Russia's reputation in the world, kind of lauding the fact that Russia had built at a time when it was not very well developed the world's most difficult railway line to build.
Now, the railway stretches from Moscow all the way through Mongolia to China and even almost to North Korea. Is that correct?
Well, that is the original line. It goes. You've slightly conflated two things there. The original railway went through a place called Harbin in Manchuria and through to Vladivostok, which is close to the North Korean border. But then later on in 1916, that was finished in 1901. In 1916, they built what was called the Amur Railway, which was north of the Amur River, about 600-700 miles longer, but all in Russian territory, so they didn't go through Manchuria. And then there's a third kind of part that goes through Mongolia down to Beijing, and that was built around the same time as the Amur Railway. And so there's, in fact, the Trans-Siberian isn't one single railway, and there is now, finished in the 1980s, the Baikal-Amur main line, which is actually another Trans-Siberian railway north of the existing one. So there's several railways, but the standard route is really from Moscow to Vladivostok, which is 5,750 miles, and there's a sign at the end, which I think gives it in kilometers, which is sort of 8,000 something kilometers.
Now, and then it splits into about 4 or 5 different locations into the other additional railways. Is that correct?
That's right. It splits at various places. At Taichetik, the Baikal-Amur Railway goes off, and then just beyond Ulan-Ude, the Mongolian line goes off. The one through Manchuria is little used these days. That's not actually a route that has regular passenger services anymore. So people travel on it mostly will go to Irkutsk and then to Ulan-Ude and then through to Khabarovsk and then end up in Vladivostok. And the best part of the journey is actually the bit that goes just south of Lake Baikal, where you do get some fantastic views of what is one of the biggest lakes in the world.
Now let's go to the building of this incredible railroad. My question starts with, how long did it take to build? Was it a group of mostly prisoners in Siberia who built it, or who were the people who built it? How many perished? And also part of the question is, has the railways, the ground, has it, sunk, moving? How does it stay on, even through all this time?
Okay. One part of the amazing achievement is that it was largely built in 10 years, from 1891 to 1901. It wasn't kind of entirely finished. In a way, it was kind of work in progress, but the line was finished, but it had lots of curves that were rather steep. It was built with fairly short bits of track, so there were a lot of derailments in the first couple of years that it was used, and the line speed was probably around 15-20 miles an hour for the most. Nowadays it's sort of 60, but nevertheless, it was largely built in 10 years, largely not by prison labour, largely by people imported from either from Western Russia or from other countries. Lots of Persians, Italians, all sorts of other races, and peoples contribute to the construction. Towards the middle, they did start to employ some prisoners, and that proved pretty successful because they gave the prisoners time off in lieu. So if you worked for the railway for a year, you got about 10 months off your jail sentence. So as well as spending the time building the railway rather than sitting in prison. So that was quite a incentive. They also got paid a little bit, and they also had a system by which they ensured that people didn't escape, because they had little groups of 20 or 30 people, and they said if any of you escape, all the rest will just be thrown back in jail. And so and also, how would you escape into the vastness of the steppe? Mostly it was built in the summer. There were little bits of work continued in the winter, but for the most part, the period that they could build was 6 or 7 months. So if you think about this, they built, some of the railway had been built before, about 1,500 miles. So they built about 4,000 miles of railway in 10 summers through, very deserted territory. There weren't many local people. It was really people who came along. They set up in camps and built this line, which was again part of the fantastic organization of the Russians and a tribute to their engineering. The last bit to be completed were the bridges, which were sometimes the most difficult. Russian rivers are sometimes a mile and a half wide, and building the bridges was a great and difficult task. And another achievement is that not many people perished. There were many earlier railways where literally hundreds or thousands of people died. But in this case, from all the stuff I've read about it, and of course, we're reliant on contemporary records, people did die building the bridges. They fell off the bridges. That was kind of, some people certainly died. But on the whole, the death rate was not great. They were fed properly. The conditions were not bad. And, by and large, it was done without the sort of horrible death toll that some other railways suffered from.
Wow. When you said that people were imported from other countries, in what sense? Were they given, was there an ad, come to Russia to work or something like that? Or
yes, there were recruiters who went around trying to bring these people in. They were willing workers. They didn't they were not press ganged in any way into it. They were lured, so they had to be paid kind of reasonable wages, and they needed some of those skills. And interestingly enough, one of the great skills that was imported was from America. Some of the construction, the pre-construction of bridges and the design of bridges actually came from America. Some American factories built some of the parts that went into building the line. So there were quite a lot of people employed in America on building this great Russian engineering achievement.
Now, tell me this. The land changes. Sometimes houses sink and there's maybe black ice on a road. How does this affect a railway like the Trans-Siberian? Is there ever black ice? Can it, ruin things? And does the land sink or move? And does the railway sink? Anything like that?
Well, mostly the railway was built south of where the permafrost is. That was the problem with the Baikal-Amur main line, which was built on the permafrost. Now, permafrost is really problematic because it's ancient sort of frozen ground, and if you disturb it, it doesn't necessarily refreeze solidly in the next winter because it's kind of, as it were, ancient cold. But for the most part, the Trans-Siberian is actually quite far south. You might not think it when the temperatures are as when we visited, sort of -15, -20, but it's not as far north as much as Siberia. So they didn't encounter the problems with melting the permafrost and placing down the sleepers and the rails. Nevertheless, it was not that easy territory to build it. Not very mountainous, quite flat, but the forest had to be chopped down. The conditions that people worked on were quite difficult and so on. But it wasn't as difficult as I say later on, the Baikal-Amur main line, which was a much more difficult territory because it was north of Lake Baikal, whereas this is south of Lake Baikal.
Did they ever have to redo large portions on the road because something happened to the land at the time, or has it basically stayed?
They did redo some sections. The most difficult section was what's called the Circum-Baikal Railway, which was literally the coastal railway along the south of the Baikal Lake. And the problem there was that there's rocks going straight into the lake. They had to create ledges, lots of blowing things up to create those ledges. And eventually that section has now been abandoned, and the line actually, for the most part, goes through the hills behind the lake and goes through tunnels and new territory rather than that. But aside from that, by and large, they didn't encounter that many geological problems.
Now, a few questions about titles. Trans-Siberian Express. Now, it takes about approximately 2 weeks to get through, correct?
No, it's 6 to 7 days. And there is a misnomer here, which is unfortunately reflected in the American title of my book, which is that there isn't actually such a thing as the Trans-Siberian Express. Mm-hmm. It's the Trans-Siberian Railway, mm-hmm. And there is no particular train, despite the fact that this features on the cover of my book. That was a one-off rail celebration of 100 years of the line, mm-hmm. And that was called the Trans-Siberian Express. But the day-to-day services take about 6.5 days if you get the one train, which is called the Rossiya, which is slightly more luxurious than the other trains, and that's the fastest one. It takes 6.5 days. Most of the other trains don't quite go the whole route, so they might go to Novosibirsk or somewhere and then stop and then go back or whatever. And they may take a little bit longer because you have to get off. But it can be done in 6.5 days in one train. But I wouldn't recommend that. When we went, we got off on 3 or 4 different places. You are so far away from anywhere else that you might as well kind of get off and look at the countryside and just think about the vastness of our Earth, because it makes you think that. We travelled from Vladivostok westwards. So we went all the way to Vladivostok and then by plane, and then took the train back westwards. And it was really, that's why I call it to the edge of the world, because when we got to the ocean there, you just think you really reached the edge of the world. And for the first 2.5 days that you're traveling back, until you get to Ulan-Ude, there isn't much. There's one big town, Khabarovsk, and that's about it. And there is pretty much nothing for 2.5 days of traveling on the train, which I thought was a wonderful experience.
So when you reach the edge of the world, as it is, stated kind of image-wise, the beginning of the world then would be Japan, right?
Or the United States, yes. I suppose so. I mean, that's the date line, of course, is between the Japan and the United States, isn't it? So that's where you start the day. It just feels that Vladivostok is kind of so far away from anywhere else. And yes, the nearest place is Japan, but it's 7 time zones away from Moscow, which incidentally the train operates on Moscow time. So wherever you take the train, it's always the Moscow time which is advertised, and that can be confusing to people because they look at their watches and they're 3 or 4 hours out from. So I'm sure a lot of people have missed the train because they haven't realised they're on Moscow time.
Also the Kuril Islands really would be in the middle of that. They would be the closest.
Yes, indeed, which are disputed between Japan and Russia, of course.
Yeah. Now, Trans-Siberian, it's very interesting because the Trans-Siberian means what exactly? That it goes through Siberia?
Yes, it does. Yes, and that's an accurate description of it, because it goes through Siberia, not very fast, but it certainly goes through it.
So let's talk about the trains themselves. You mentioned the train Russia, which is the premier version of the trip, the train itself. Now, there's many others. Now, talking about I've seen some of the different wagons, and they have different rooms that are embellished in classical motif. And then, of course, there's things like third class, which is pretty horrifying, I'd say.
Not really. I mean, look, those pictures of kind of really smart kind of trains, they're generally historic and they don't really exist anymore. They had real luxury trains, which would take, diplomats from, say, Europe through to China. And that was a good way to go when the boats, the ships would take kind of several weeks, and actually, even in those days, you could do it on the Trans-Siberian in 10 or 12 days. So, but they no longer really exist, apart from kind of privately run tourist trains. But the basic train is not bad at all. The third class, which you mentioned, has 45 or 50 people sleeping in the same area, but it's clean, it's heated. You each have your little curtains to kind of, think Marilyn Monroe in
Some Like It Hot.
Like It Hot, whatever that movie is called. Some Like It Hot.
That sounds pretty horrible,
that's the sort of accommodation they have in third class. Second class is 4 people sleeping in a little room, and first class is two people in a room, right? That's very comfortable. You can get meals on board, although I don't particularly recommend them because they're not really kind of geared up to that. Most people bring their what we in Britain call pot noodles, which is sort of a little carton with dried noodles and other things, and you pour boiling water on it and stir it around for 5 minutes. It makes you kind of hot pot noodles. And Russia has all sorts of varieties of pot noodles, and every carriage always has a samovar at the end for endless hot water. So you come on with your tea bags and your mug, and you have an endless supply of tea all day, which you trot off to the samovar and you talk to other people at it, and everybody's very friendly. Everybody who comes on, we share. We had the rooms with 4 people, and we often had local Russians coming on for part of the trip. They'd always share their food. They'd always try and talk to you. We had a long conversation with a guy who was a police dog handler, and I didn't understand it. I thought initially he worked for the docks, but he worked with dogs. So you have amusing incidents like that. It's a great experience. You let your hair down, you relax. There's no internet connection for most of it, so you can't contact the outside world. There's no phone signal, so you just have to enjoy the scenery, which is not fantastic. It's all birch trees and steps and whatever, but you're at the end of the world, and that's what you just have to chill out and enjoy it.
Now let me ask you this. So let's talk about the first class and personal wagons just for a second. We'll skip third class for now. Do you feel in first class, first of all, have you tried the dining car, aside from the noodles? I mean, have you enjoyed the dinners in the dining car? And also, did you feel crammed into the personal spaces in the first class, or did you feel like you had enough space?
No, we were in second class, but even in second class, it was absolutely fine. There was plenty of space. Okay. We did occasionally go into the dining car, and I must say they really run for the benefit of the people working in the dining car. They're not particularly interested in serving you dinners, and most of the stuff is not on the menu. And although we paid for some stuff, they brought it to us. And there was a guy in the morning who'd come and say, fish, pig, cow. Fish, pig, cow.
What is that?
And you think, what's he talking about? And it was like whether the soup would be fish or pig or cow or beef. And that was all the English you knew. So, I don't recommend buying the meals. You can, certainly on the eastern sections, there's a lot of old ladies selling stuff on the platforms, which is much better food, blinis and the like. And a lot of stations, they stop for 25 minutes or half an hour, so you have plenty of time to stretch your legs, buy some stuff off the old ladies, and enjoy it later on. I really wouldn't recommend the dining car, even if you're traveling in first class.
Oh my! So they just run around and scream fish, pig, cow.
Fish, pig, cow. Yes. And you get a sort of greasy but quite tasty soup, and that's about it.
Oh my God! Now, what about some dignitaries and celebrities in Russia? They have their own entire train wagon where they have a nice large shower and a nice bed. Are you familiar with any of those joining, like a Russia train or any other trains? And
I'm not sure that still exists, but maybe if your knowledge might be better than mine. But I think that nowadays the rich Russians would travel by plane, and I doubt whether that still happens. In the old days, it undoubtedly happened.
It still happens because
it happened in America actually, where you could hitch your J.P. Morgan and the like had to go on trains which they hitched to America. But you're suggesting it still happens. I haven't heard of that.
It does. A lot of celebrities in Russia who travel for tours throughout Russia, they do have their own wagons, entire wagons with a big shower. And I've seen some documentaries recently, very recent, where they show specific ones. But it's always interesting to me, how do they add the wagon on? Where do they meet them? And how does that work?
most trains nowadays are kind of fixed formation. In other words, they're a certain number of carriages and they're all hooked together. And because there's vast amounts of software involved, they're all hooked together. But the Russian trains are still very much carriages being pulled by locomotives. So you can quite easily hitch an extra carriage or two to the back. And indeed, my friend who runs a company specializing in taking tourists on trains across the world, he owns a luxury train in Russia, and he hitches on kind of wagons at will. If he sells a lot of seats on his trains, he adds an extra wagon or two, and if he doesn't have very many punters doing it, he doesn't.
Let's talk a little bit about emergencies, sightseeing, and a couple more things. First of all, like you said, there's limited cell service, but what if there's an emergency? Like, what if somebody needs a doctor? What does one do? You know, people who plan ahead.
I mean, they're unlikely to be a doctor on board, but they do trundle through small towns, kind of, every hour or two. So I don't think that would be an issue, and they would certainly stop in an emergency. The tourist trains that my friend operates do have a doctor on board permanently, and he would always organise for a doctor to be present. But I don't think people should be too worried. This is not kind of the end of civilization. The Russians are, sophisticated bunch, and they have, hospitals and medical facilities everywhere.
Now, when you get off at all the small stops, do they have nice restaurants and dining areas at all the stations so that you can eat normally, aside from noodles?
I wouldn't quite say that, no. Okay. There's probably a local cafe that will serve you some very nice dumplings and nice borscht or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't kind of, expect... there's certainly not McDonald's out there, and there's certainly not kind of any fine dining, I'm afraid. Look, part of travel is experiencing different cultures, and
right.
this is a different culture, and you're not going to starve to death, but you're not going to get kind of Michelin starred meals. But as I say, if you want that experience, you travel with my mate, whose company is called Golden Eagle, and he organises trips, but there you're spending $10,000-$15,000 for a trip, whereas we spent maybe $500 each in travelling the whole length of the line.
Did you take the Russia train or a different train?
Well, we were on the Russia train for a bit of it, and it's slightly more comfortable. They have TVs in each of the compartments and so on, so it's slightly more comfortable, but it's not enormously different.
Now let's talk about visas and Agatha Christie and sightseeing. How many visas does a person need if they, for example, have to go to Mongolia or China or even North Korea or stay in Russia?
No, you won't. You probably won't get into North Korea like that. You'd probably have to come in a different way. But you need one for Belarus, which you might go through Russia, through Mongolia. You need separate visas for those, and China. You obviously need separate visas, but you can just do the trip in Russia. Okay. You can just fly to Moscow, take the train to Vladivostok, and come back, and not go to any other countries at all. So that's the simplest trip.
If I was to take the train, I would go to Vladivostok and then fly to Japan, because I love Japan. That would be a short flight. Let me ask you, so Agatha Christie and sightseeing. So the super famous Murder on the Orient Express. Now, does that have anything to do with the Trans-Siberian Railroad?
It doesn't at all. No, the Orient Express went from, it doesn't exist anymore, sadly. There was a company called the Orient Express Company, but that's a private company like my friend's Golden Eagle. The Orient Express ran from Constantinople, as it was, Istanbul, through to Paris, through Turkey, Yugoslavia, as it then was, Austria, and whatever. There were a couple of different routes, but that has nothing to do with it. And there was actually, I've written about that train, and there never was, as far as we know, a murder on the Orient Express. Although there was some American who was found dead next to the line in the 1950s. That was slightly unexplained, but there was never really a murder on the Orient Express.
So let's talk about the sightseeing on the Trans-Siberian Railway. You mentioned a lot of birch trees, and now what are some of you mentioned the beautiful river and the bridges. What are some other things that took your breath away?
Certainly the Baikal Lake does. One of the best bits is going through the Urals, but unfortunately we did that at night. So to be entirely honest, there is not a great deal of spectacular scenery. It's largely forest. Sometimes you can see out kind of a few miles in the distance when the fields open up, but that's not there are many beautiful railways in the world, and I've been on lots of them, but that isn't what the experience is about. The experience is about distance, about the culture, about the people, about the engineering achievement, about the fact that you can take a train for 6.5 days, and it takes that long to get you to your destination. So of the towns, Novosibirsk is pretty awful because it was built entirely after 1900. It didn't exist before that. Irkutsk is a lovely place with lots of tradition, and it was an exile place for many of the people who were against the Tsarist regime, the Decembrists they were called, who had attempted a revolution as early as 1825, and they were exiled there. So there's quite a lot of culture there. Ulan-Ude is a very Asian-feeling place with the local Buryat people who look a little bit like the Eskimo people, but the Inuits, but slightly different. But and that has a completely different feel about it. It also has the biggest statue of Lenin, or whether it's just a head of Lenin in black marble, which is still standing because I think it would cost them too much to blow it up, really. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. Again, and Ekaterinburg, which is famous, of course, because that's where the last Tsar and his family were murdered near there, and there is a huge and hideous church called the St. Nicholas Church, kind of in his honor. He was kind of sainted after his death by the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's quite a pleasant town. But as I say, it's not about that. There's quite a lot of culture to be had, but it's not about that. It's about the sheer scale of it and the momentous kind of feeling that you're on the longest railway in the world. So it's not for everybody, but I love it. I've been on it 3 times, and I hope to do it some more times as well.
Have you been back and forth in one trip, or just one way each time?
I've gone one way each time. I've gone Vladivostok to Moscow, and then vice versa, and then I also went on the Baikal-Amur line once, which really goes into wild territory where there are very few villages and very few people.
Have you seen any interesting wild animals?
Not a single one.
Okay.
We looked out for bears all the time. I think I might have seen the odd elk or something, but no, absolutely very few animals, very few birds even. we did wonder why there were so few birds. But I suppose it's the cold weather in the winter, and not many birds kind of were there at the time that we were there. No, I'm afraid not.
What about these two subjects? Going to sound strange together, but northern lights and showers. Have you seen northern lights through the?
It's too far south for the northern lights.
And then
if you look at the line actually, and you compare it with London, it kind of hovers around the same latitude as London. So at some point it's further north than London, but at some points it's actually further south than London. So it's not the far kind of north in the way that you might expect. So no northern lights and no meteor showers. No.
What about regular showers on the train? Is there a shower?
In the time I've been on the trains, it's hardly rained at all. Remember, this is largely very far away from the sea.
No, I mean literal showers. Can you shower in the train?
Sorry. You didn't mean rain showers.
Well, we went through all of them, which is great.
I think there might be in first class, but there certainly wasn't in second class.
Okay. Is that a problem?
No, we could live without showers in the 21st century. You wash in a basin like people have traditionally done for many years. There is, of course, when you take the Golden Eagle luxury train, yes, there are showers in the compartments. Which operate with very limited water, so you have to push a button every 10 seconds. So they have showers. So I presume there are showers on the main trains in first class, but there certainly weren't in second class.
And you mentioned a lot of very interesting sites and locations. Overall, if this was a book, how many chapters would there be? And what I mean by that is each chapter is a different feeling, a different experience, a whole different world.
Absolutely, you could. I mean, yes, you could. Well, my book's a history of it, but you could certainly write a contemporary book on just visiting. In fact, there are a couple of guides to the Trans-Siberian Railway published by, I think there's a rough guide and there's a Lonely Planet one as well, and they're stacked full of information. They're certainly quite thick books because the history is so fascinating. I mean, we haven't got into the history, but the Trans-Siberian probably meant that Russia won the Second World War, when it would probably, without the Trans-Siberian, it wouldn't, because they basically took all their industry down eastwards beyond the Urals and got it away from where the Germans could invade. It had played a big role in the Russian Revolution. It played a big role in the Civil War thereafter. And it even, as I suggest, played a role in the downfall of communism because of the building of the Baikal and the main line, which was absorbed so many resources and was a big mistake. It played a role in the fall of the Tsars because, again, they spent so much money building it. And had they spent that money on kind of welfare or looking after their people, education, whatever, they might not have had the 1917 revolution. So I think the whole history of the line is a great story.
It's a very interesting point you brought up about it being a cause for the revolution, because in my opinion, there's so many causes, including, most importantly, hemophilia, which was brought in by Queen Victoria. It made the family so weak, with the heir being, so weak, and having to rely on Rasputin, who I have a movie about that I've been working for 10 years, which really made the public not trust the value of the royal family. So there's so much to that.
I think that's a good point, but I also think Nikolai, the last Tsar, was stuck in a kind of Victorian view of the world, where he absolutely believed in absolute monarchy. Whereas if he had kind of yielded a bit and conceded that the people should have a say, and if he created a real Duma, a real parliament, rather than stymieing any moves towards the kind of democracy that was taking root in the rest of Europe, we might not be in the situation we're in today. But and you're right, they were weak. They were kind of very separate from the people. There was no kind of attempt to, they saw themselves as completely separate and apart, and so there was no kind of move towards the sort of social democracy that we saw elsewhere. It's a very sad story, actually.
Very sad.
Russia is both a wonderful place, but it's a sad place in that it's never had the rulers that such a great nation deserves.
And also they believe, Nicholas believed that God would always protect him no matter what, and even though he was given refuge into the UK, he never took it because he thought God would protect him because he's a czar. So there was a lot of that fullness of self.
I thought the story was that we didn't let him in, actually.
No.
Yes. Oh, right.
You think you didn't let, because from the other side is that he just decided not to go.
Right.
Interesting. I wonder what is.
Because our king was often blamed for not letting him in because they didn't want the trouble of having him in there because they thought it would foment revolution in this country.
Huh.
But
I wonder what the real story is then in that. But back to your book and this incredible railway. I'm so glad that it was built. Sometimes when you give all the money to social causes, it dissipates in time, like steam. But when you spend it on something like this, it lasts forever, just like castles and museums and the railway. I love that.
Well, I sometimes have some doubts. I mean, like all these cathedrals that were built on the labour of kind of peasants, would we not have done better investing that money and educating those peasants? And then we could have maybe had the Industrial Revolution kind of 500 years before we had it. And then you and I would have been now operating technology that we couldn't dream of. Yes, I'm not entirely sure about that. I do think that the Trans-Siberian had the greatest impact of any railway that was ever built, and I say that at the end of my book. It had as I said, an impact on the outcome of the wars. It had an impact on the revolution, and it still has a strong impact today. In terms of the fact that I think its very existence means that Russia looked more eastwards than it looked westwards. And if it hadn't been built, it's quite possible that the land east of the Urals would really have been a kind of forgotten area, and Russia might have seen itself as more part of the West, where, after all, the language of the language my father used most comfortably, as he was he wasn't an aristocrat, but he was middle class, was French. The Russians all spoke French and looked towards France as their kind of example, and maybe history would have been very different if it hadn't been built. Hey, we can only speculate.
Do you one more question about this? There's such a vast majority of undeveloped space there where the railroad goes through. Why do you think it's endlessly undeveloped, aside from the terrain and the weather?
Well, because it's not great agricultural land. There is some agriculture, but it's not great. There's a very short growing season, so you can't grow many crops. The railway did bring in quite a lot of people, and they did develop some of the land, but it's probably impossible to sustain a very big population there. It's just simply that particularly north of the railway, it's just the conditions are just too harsh and difficult, and so I think that's there was nomadic people there, and there were nomads because agriculture was not good enough to ensure that you could feed your animals all the year round without moving them around.
Now, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience about your beautiful book, To the Edge of the World, the story of the Trans-Siberian Express, the world's greatest railroad, available on Amazon and in your bookstores?
I would just like to say that those who managed to listen to the end of this very interesting conversation we've had. I'll just say, do it. You know, it's just such a. It blew my mind, really. You know, even though I'd known about it or whatever. Just when you're so far away from anything else, and there's just this train, the road through to Vladivostok is still pretty bad, and you know the main way to get there is by rail or by air, of course, and you know it's such a worthwhile experience. You'll never forget it.
Well, thank you so much, Christian Wolmar, for your fantastic factual storytelling. And audience, check out Christian's plethora of books on travel and railways, and on his website. And your website for our audience is?
It's just www.christianwolmar.co.uk.
Wonderful.
It's got over 1,400 articles I've written and biography and all the rest of the stuff, but it's got a vast amount of stuff that I've written, including some odd things about the Trans-Siberian. Wonderful.
Thank you so much for being on the Archetypal Mosaic, and much success in traveling.
Thank you. Pleasure.